So I'm going to be reading The Valentine Bear, and it is targeted for K through 2. It is about two bears, Mr. and Mrs. Bear, and they have never got to celebrate Valentine's Day because they have always been in hibernation. So Mrs. Bear wants to set her alarm early for February 14th in hopes that she can surprise Mr. Bear. And this is by Eve Bunting, and the pictures are by Jan Brett. It was October 14th, and the bear's den was snug and secure for the winter. And this is the bear's den. Mrs. Bear set her alarm for February 14th. Then she curled herself comfortably against Mr. Bear's back and listened to his snores. It was good to settle down for a long 4-month sleep. When the alarm went off 4 months later, Mrs. Bear could hardly believe it. It seemed as if she'd just gone to bed. "My," she said, yawning, "spring already." And then she remembered. It wasn't spring yet. She'd set her alarm early for a special reason. There they are sleeping. Mrs. Bear settled down, Mrs. Bear scratched, and kissed Mr. Bear on his nose, and got up. Mr. Bear could sleep through just about anything, and she was glad. She had things that she had to do. First, she made a sign. It's nice to share Valentine's Day with someone you love. She tacked the sign on the wall so Mr. Bear would see it the instant that he woke up. There she is making the sign and waking up. Leaves had blown into the den while they slept. Mrs. Bear brushed them into a pile and swept them outside. "Birds," she said, standing in front of the den. "You'd think they'd put this special day in summer." Mr. Bear and I had never shared a Valentine's Day in our years together. And here she is outside. Mrs. Bear dug up the honey pot she'd buried in the fall. She pawed off the lid and smiled. It was fruity and rich and smelled of summer, just the way Mr. Bear liked. Mrs. Bear carried the pot inside and put it on the table next to the bowl of crunchy, dried beetles and bugs. Crispy critters! How Mr. Bear loved crispy critters. She had made 2 Valentine poems way back in summer. Now she got them out of the drawer. One said, "Red berries are red, blueberries are blue, termites are sweet, and you are too." And the other one said, "Your teeth are so sharp, your claws are so fine, dear Mr. Bear, you are my Valentine." She couldn't decide which poem she liked best, so she decided to give them both to Mr. Bear. Mrs. Bear huddled herself deep in her coat and went outside again. Only crazy creatures would be out in this early in the year, she muttered. The sun shone through the haze, pale as milk. Crows crawled in the white air, the arms of the trees scratched at the sky. Mrs. Bear clawed away the ice on top of the pond. She splashed water on her ears and muzzle. She sleeked her head fur and took a long, cold drink. It was time to awaken Mr. Bear. Mr. Bear's snores drifted from the den, and she smiled. Mr. Bear could sleep through just about anything. Mrs. Bear shook his shoulder. "Time to get up, Mr. Bear." "Honk," snored Mr. Bear. Mrs. Bear shook harder. "Wake up, Mr. Bear." Mr. Bear shrugged her away and turned his face to the wall. "Just another 5 weeks, he begged. Mrs. Bear poked his back. "Happy Valentine's Day." Mr. Bear curled himself into a fur ball. "Honk." "Oh, no, you don't." Mrs. Bear pulled Mr. Bear's ears till he uncurled himself. She tickled his paws. She pried open his eyes and watched him drop close. "Honk," said Mr. Bear. Mrs. Bear sighed. She took their empty berry can, snuggled deep in her coat, and went back outside. A wolverine slept safe in a hollow. A deer drank from the pond. It stopped drinking and looked at Mrs. Bear with surprise as she filled the berry can. Mrs. Bear decided the bear had never seen a bear out and about so early. She carried the can of ice water inside. "I'm sorry about this, Mr. Bear," she said, "but you just can't keep on sleeping. This is a very special day. 1, 2, 3. Surprise! Mr. Bear shouted and sat straight up. It was a surprise, all right. Mrs. Bear jumped and the water splashed all over her. Mr. Bear hugged her. You thought I could sleep through just about anything, didn't you? He boomed. Well, I fooled you. Happy Valentine's Day. He pulled a box from under his pillow. I've had these here all along. Oh, Mr. Bear, chocolate-covered ants, my very favorite. Mr. Bear licked his lips. Mine, too. He admired the sign on the wall. Then Mrs. Bear ran for the poems, and Mr. Bear read them aloud. Dear Mr. Bear, you are my Valentine. That's lovely. His nose wrinkled. Is that fruity, rich, summer, honey I smell? Mrs. Bear smiled. Will you join me at the table? They sat together sharing the Valentine treats till shadows filled the den and the bowls in the box and the honey pot were empty and the special day ended. And then they went to sleep again until spring. And this was the Valentine Bears.